two things were asked of me to address, and I'll try and address them as I go through this slide. One was colonial gaze, and the other one was uh, empathy, which the type of empathy that I'm referring to is active empathy. It goes beyond saying, as I said, the land acknowledgement and I have privilege. So I want to talk about fear, anger, and loathing, and the stuff that Fanon talked about and other people mentioned as I went through that said, look, this is going on. And I want to tell you some of the experiences that I've had with, I'm going to talk mostly about children. This was a little 13-year-old Black female, and she lives in what is commonly referred to as below the tracks, and predominantly, used to be a predominantly Black part of the city, and now it's been gentrified, and a lot of those people have been dislocated. But this little girl, used to go to McDonald's a lot and places like Burger King and so forth. And I was talking to her one day, was doing some volunteer work, and I said to her that I was going up to St. Catherine. I was going to go to a restaurant and have some lunch. And I asked her if she wanted to ask her mom if she could come with me. And she said, "But I go, we're going to go to McDonald's. I'd really like a Big Mac." And I said, "Well, I don't eat that. I don't like that food. I'm going to go to this other restaurant." And she said, "Can Black people go into those restaurants on St. Catherine?" Now, I want to tell you, this was in the last 5 years. This is not something that happened 10 or 15 years ago. This is in the last 5 years. The other one is a 9-year-old girl. I was giving a talk up in Colton Edge, and I was introduced as a psychologist. And this child said, "Are you really a psychologist?" And I said, "Yes." She said, "I didn't know we had those. How did you get to be that? How did they allow you to be that?" And I said, "Who are they?" I knew what she meant, but I wanted to hear her articulate it. I said, "Who are they?" And she said, "The white people. They allowed you to be a psychologist?" A little boy, I think I mentioned this morning, sitting in the church and was looking around. And after Sunday school, he said to me, definitively, he said, "There are no Black people in heaven." And then he looked at me and he said, "Right?" But the first thing was that definitive statement. And then this last one I want to tell you about is something that happened to me. I was trying to rent an apartment. This, admittedly, was more than 10 years ago. It was actually in Nova Scotia. And the man, the landlord, refused to rent it to me. And he said to me, "I am a Christian, and I believe that there's a heaven for white people and one for the rest of you." Now, talking about the colonial gaze, what the colonial gaze has done, and this comes back to what someone asked me this morning, why I was starting at the 17th century for this type of colonialism. When colonialism started, a different type started around the 14th century. But the colonial gaze started around the 14th century, 15th century, when people were traveling and, taking the grand tour, and they'd go around the world. And it was looking at people through that colonial gaze. So you have people determining that people from the Indian subcontinent were essentially savages, and Black people were going to put people in pots and boil them. And this carried through up into Margaret Mead, who eventually had to apologize for that horrible thing she wrote about people from Guinea. She just had to retract that. But that colonial gaze is seeing things and people through those eyes of above the line, through that colonial gaze, and then acting as though it's right and correct and continuing it on, passing it on. And so if you look at things through those eyes, then there's always going to be, because the colonial gaze determines who is civilized and who is not. So if you were one of these people who could get on the ship and travel around the world and do the travel logs and send back these letters, long letters to home and saying, oh, you should see these terrible, terrible, terrible pygmies and these terrible, then you saw yourself as civilized and others as uncivilized. So that then, remember, the first thing I showed you last night was culture, the three types of culture and how they're closely intertwined. That colonial gaze that led to people talking about Indians and cowboys. And of course, the Indians were always wrong. There was nothing about this is the land of indigenous people that's being taken away from them. No, 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 no. We had and I remember that the good guy always wore the white hat and the bad guy always wore the black hat and dressed it. You always knew who the good people were. The good people were white and wore white hats. And then there were the Indians hooting and hollering and, with body paint and just out to kill all the white people and especially the white women. This has also continued into interactions with the enslaved. So white women were pure, and all black women, according to this colonial gaze, all black men wanted to sleep with white women and I wanted to rape them. You look at D.W. Griffith's horrible, horrible film of The Birth of a Nation. That was the entire premise of it. That's what got Emmett Till killed, a 15-year-old boy. And now the woman who accused him has come back and said, none of that happened. I was forced to say that by my husband and my brother-in-law. Nothing's happened to her. She just said, I lied. That's what got 4 little girls killed in a church in Birmingham. That colonial gaze of saying these people are uncivilized is what happened when the United States Congress was able to say that a black person is worth only 3/5 of a white person. Why the Darlings were refused, why they wouldn't let the Darlings get married in Virginia, and they had to leave Virginia and go to Washington. And some of those things happen here in Canada, like with the Thorntons. But one of the things is in the last session, when I asked people to talk about what they would personally do, people talked about, oh well, we should have more, for example, about Martin Luther King and leave the pictures up. What we don't talk about is what we teach our children here about Canada. There were a lot of First Nations, Indigenous people, and Black people who did a lot of things here. It's not taught. So we're always rushing to the United States to find references. We talk about Martin Luther King, we talk about James Baldwin, all wonderful people, Oprah Winfrey, fine, but a lot of good things happen here. The reason we have lights at night here started right here in Montreal is that Latimer came up from Massachusetts and had invented a new type of filament which allowed the lights to stay on the lamppost. And of course, from that, we evolved into having these lights 24 hours a day. But it was because of Latimer, a Black man, and other things happening here. We had James Weir out in Alberta. We had Viola Desmond. We had the Thorntons in Toronto. One of the first Black millionaires. One of the first millionaires we had there. A black family. We had Black families who started things in St. Catherine. We can talk about how at the end of the Underground Railway, it wasn't so good for a lot of people. A lot of people were captured and sent back to the United States. They were sold back into slavery. But then we can also talk about people who started things like McCoy, although this thing saying that he is the original reason we say the real McCoy is not true, but McCoy, who developed the train, the part for the train so that people weren't burning themselves and the thing didn't stop all the time. All these things happened here. First Nations people, but we always run into the United States. But that brings us, which brings us into the question, if you're looking at things through a colonial gaze, or even if you're just looking at things, someone said, Well, I think it was Jennifer said, okay, we're talking about all this empathy. How do we put empathy into action? I prefer active empathy rather than empathy. Empathy is great, but you got to go beyond there. And I'm going to tell you about that at the end of the thing. But right now, active empathy means I look at this, I empathize with it, and I go one step further. What do I as a human being do? What do I as an ally do? And last night we talked about walking next to the person and asking them what their needs are rather than imposing our ideas on them. That's part of active empathy. So when I say, if I don't know you or you're on a metro and you sneeze, I'm automatically going to say, bless you. But deep down inside, I don't know you. It makes no difference to me whether you're blessed or not. And it makes no difference to you whether, but if you say to me, would you like a tissue? Or is there something wrong? Is there something I can do for you? Are you not feeling well? You've gone beyond the empathy of bless you. That a phrase that means absolutely nothing. So we have to go beyond. I recognize my privilege. I don't even pay attention when people say that anymore. So as Christopher said earlier, get out there, get at some of the margins, right wrongs when we see them, stand up, be counted, run the risk of a friend saying, I'm angry at you for making me look at myself. Run the risk of your family saying, I don't want to look at this. You have no business. Run the risk. Do something active. Otherwise, it's just words. Which brings us to this last section, thing, the glass ceiling. A lot of people say, "Oh, I want to get into the glass ceiling. I want to crack the glass ceiling." But if no one helps you to crack that glass ceiling, as Anna Mead Paul said the other day, she cracked it all by herself and she came out with shards of glass all over. She said, I was spitting up blood because I was left there. Look, nobody was there. And so you've got a lot of women, for example, who say, I want to get into the boardroom. I want to crack the glass ceiling. But they don't ask, well, but you've got people at home from the Philippines or the Caribbean or poor Polish women looking after your kids. They've got to stay there and look after your kids when you go out to crack the glass ceiling. Does that not bother you? And I'm not saying don't try to crack the glass ceiling. Of course, I'm not saying that. But I want to tell you about this client of mine. She and I had this conversation once about the glass ceiling. And she has a live-in maid who looks at, well, I call it the maid because the nanny and maid and everything rolled into one, and au pair, everything rolled into one. And she's from the Philippines, and she's looking after this lady's daughter. And she sends money back to her family. She sends her remits back to her family in the Philippines to help them. And she's got her two children with her. And the two children live in because their mom lives in. And my client said to me one day, she said, you're going to be really proud of me. And I said, well, what did you do? And she said, I have decided that I don't want this woman's children to grow up having to look after my daughter's children. She says, so I'm sending, her daughter goes to private school. She says that those two girls go to the same school as my daughter and I paid for it. She said, my daughter's taking piano lessons. The guy comes to my house to give piano lessons. He gives them to these two girls also. She said, I'm trying to do my bit. I'm trying to do active empathy. And she says, and I make sure that the mother knows it's not charity on my part. But as Martin Luther King says, the right time, there's always a right time to do the right thing. So that's an example of active empathy. I don't expect everyone to have the money to do that, obviously not. But what can you do? As she said, what can you do so that that lady's children don't continue and grow up to be looking after your child's children? How do we give them a hand up? So while some people are trying to get through the glass ceiling, other people are stuck to the sticky floor. And we have to be cognizant of that. What are the demands that we put on that horrible phrase, BIPOC people? And I told you what I had against it last night. Put on BIPOC people. Their perception very often is thus far and no further. Because what we do is, oh, you're BIPOC? I'm going to put you in the diversity office. And I've done my bit. I've given you a job and you can go over there and deal with diversity. And they get stuck there. sometimes we don't give them the promotion, whether it's an indigenous person, a BIPOC, whatever. We don't give them the promotion, but we get them to train the other people who are coming in. And the other people that they've trained get the promotions and get the jobs, and they're stuck there still doing the training. They're good enough to train others, but they're not good enough to be given the job. And that continues to see things through a colonial gaze of who should be on top and who should be on bottom, who should be above the line and who should be below the line.
Myrna,
So, yeah, oh, yes, my dear.
are you sharing slides?
Of course, you can't see my slide?
No. Could you just check your sharing again, please?
Oh, that's weird. Let me check again, because I had them up sharing, of course. Let me see if I can find, I gotta pull you back in now, gotta find out. Because I was out for a minute. Let's see. Gotta get back a picture of you. Hang on. Where are you? Where are you? I've got let me reduce this and see if I can find you. Okay, there you are. Can you see me?
I see you, but not your slides yet.
Okay, no, I'll try and find the part now again. I got to open that. Okay, let me go back and share again. Hang on. Let me see. That's another talk. Let's see. Let me see. Got so many things up here. That's not it. Okay, where is it? I might have to hang on for a minute. I have to close it and start off. Okay. Hang on. Yeah,
While you're doing that, I'll let Camille ask her question.
Yeah, okay. Go ahead, Camille. Let me pull this up and see if I can pull this up again. Is that it? Let me see. No, that's not. That's another one. Okay, that's not it. Go ahead, Camille. Ask your question.
Okay, so Myrna, I just wanted to mention that I really can relate to what you said a while ago with regards to the promotion and the corporate world.
Mm-hmm. I am listening.
Okay, I am currently involved with groups that are actually mentoring persons of color and Black people, in fact, also who are on a trajectory or expected to be on a trajectory towards the C-suite or senior levels in their organizations.
Mm-hmm.
And I must say that there are organizations, large corporations that are coming forward and asking for help to do this.
Good.
Okay. I just wanted to mention that we like to talk about the percentage of people and it's not inclusive and all of this. And I just wanted to relate an experience because yesterday you said that when we are going to get on the defensive or when we're going to be making or confront something, we need to be in a safe space.
Mm-hmm.
And a few years ago, I was fortunate. Well, I was in a position where I was at a strategic planning session in the boardroom, and the human resources director was bragging that the demographic and ethnic profile of the organization reflected the demographics of the Montreal community.
Mm-hmm.
The issue that I raised my hand and I said, we've got to stop just looking at it like this. Why is it that I'm the only person? Now we can see your screen.
It's funny because it said that it was sharing. Are you actually seeing what I'm doing?
Yes.
Yes.
So you can stop sharing and find what you need to present and then share again.
Isn't that interesting? Because now that it's sharing, I don't see what I'm sharing.
Oh,
Myrna, I've got your slides. Would you like me to just share your slides?
If you wish, but I want to be able to stop when I need to stop. That's the problem. I'm back to share. I'm still listening, Camille. Go ahead. I'm going to try one more time.
Yeah, so my point was that we need to stop looking just at percentages and ask the question, why is it that beyond a certain point, you don't see people of a particular ethnic minorities, or you see the diversities cutting off.
Mhm.
And what I wanted to mention, to say here, that is that a lot of persons who are on that trajectory, somehow they get stumped because they're not mentored, or they're not being helped along the way. I think the same thing should apply in the church. And I'd like you to speak to that whole question of helping people who need to adjust culturally to the broader environment, but they want to do it without being perceived as if they're being given a pass or preferential treatment, because that is another issue that
Yes.
that comes up. And there are Black people who I know who do not want to be mentored by other Black people because of the perception that it has.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I might have to ask someone to share my screen because I can't get it to come back.
Okay.
Ah,
Deborah
okay,
has
there.
it.
That's where I need to be. I'm going to answer Camille. Did you just bring that or did I do that?
No, this is Deborah that's sharing for you.
But I won't be able to move it.
You'll
You're
just
going to
have to
take
say
over and move it.
You'll
then.
just have to tell me to move it.
Okay,
next
fine.
slide.
All right. I don't know what happened there. So
No
let
problem.
me see if we can make this bigger. Anyway, don't worry about it. Go back to the slide, please, Deborah. Okay. All right. You're absolutely right. Because we have gotten into the habit and people think that, oh, I'm culturally aware. I've given these people jobs and I've put them in this so-called position of authority. Very often we burn them out in there because we don't give them any advancement. And people are saying, as you say, I don't want to be mentored by those because then just looks like more of the same. And then I got the job because of this. We've got to mentor people based on their ability, based on the jobs that they can fill. We've got to first accept and acknowledge, get out of that colonial gaze and recognize that people are skilled to do certain jobs and mentor them for those jobs. So if we need to do, one of the things I'm doing right now is I'm doing scans of a lot of companies. They've asked me to come and do scans and I'm saying, well, why don't we have people in these positions? How did you determine that these people should? There's one company, for example, that gives a reward to people who are already in the company for recommending their friends and bringing their friends. And I said, do you not see what this does? People are going to bring in people who are their friends, who look, and most people live within this small circle. We talked about that earlier, this small circle. So you're going to bring in people from your own circle, which means that other people may not be in. And it makes it difficult to do that. How do you do that if I feel that I'm being patronized and I'm being tokenized by sending me to see these people? It's like therapy. A lot of people want to come and see someone who looks like them, who have their same history, a shared history, because they believe that that person will understand them better. Women do it also. But then there are other people who don't want to be there because, there's some people who say, I don't want that First Nations doctor. I want one of the good white ones. Why can't I have one of those good white ones? I don't want that Black daughter. I want one of those good white ones. Or females say, I want one of those good male ones. It happens in every way, but it has to do with that gaze. And it has to do with active empathy. So the issue for us is, how do we scan? How do we scan our organizations? How do we scan the church? As I said last night, the church has been forward in a lot of areas, but it's fallen down in a lot. We've never had a non-white primate. And we can't just say we've got a female primate now, so that covers everything. No, it doesn't. That doesn't cover all females. And I'm going to talk about women a little bit soon too. With the women's movement, I mean, that's a whole mess right there. It's a big mess. So yes, it has to do with how we define the jobs, how we look at people's skills and why we hired them in the first place. And then mentor that person to that job rather than sending them off to see the person that we've got sitting in the diversity office. So a lot of people say, being a BIPOC means thus far, no further. This is as far as I'm going to allow you to go. It's also unusual for a white church to call a priest who's, yes, Ross. Next slide, please, Deborah. Okay, so now I want to talk about, and this ties into what you just asked me, believe it or not. Amilcar Cabral said, in combating racism, we do not make progress if we combat the people themselves. As I said, we're not talking white versus black. We're not talking other. If we combat the people themselves, we don't combat racism. We have to combat the causes of racism. If a bandit comes to my house and I have a gun, I cannot shoot the shadow of the bandit. I have to shoot the bandit. Many people lose energy and effort and make sacrifices combating shadows. We have to combat the material reality that produces the shadow, which comes back to the gaze, comes back to the mentoring, comes back to the active empathy. We've got to stop shooting the bandit shadow and shoot the bandit. We've got to get to the core of it. Stop shooting the people. Let's look at the causes of racism. As Broken Leg said, stop asking what's wrong with those people and ask what's been done to them. Next, please. So the premise we're working on now is that a professional, and you're all professionals, priesthood is a vocation, lay readers, lay clergy, it's a vocation. It's part of your professionalism. A professional who promotes equity, diversity, and inclusion is one who also promotes introspection and justice. You're not going to get that justice unless you do some introspection. It's not something that you can pull out of the ether. And looking inside is very painful, but it needs to be done. The concept of social suffering, introduced by Kleinman and et al., Arthur Kleinman says, it highlights the ways that mental illness reflects larger processes of adversity and inequity, rooted in problems of power, violence, and oppression that besets families and communities. The need to understand mental health problems and their solutions in social, cultural, historical, and political context. Remember, I told you last night that racism is not victimless, that we see issues with mental health, we see issues with physical health. That's what racism does to people. We talked last night about intergenerational trauma. We talked about people re-traumatizing themselves in order to give their kids survival skills. So we don't get to say, well, over here is religion and over here is health. That's not true. It's all intertwined. Some people use religion to help them with their health, with their mental health, but it's all intertwined. It's part of the intersectionality of being a human being. They are closely linked. They're not linked, they're intertwined. So we don't get to just separate them out. Next, please. So I'm going to go to the end of this, and then we're going to I'm going to go through the chat. I see I have 21 in the chat. The issue of women have been mentioned in the chat a few times, and I'd like to address it. A lot of the progress that has been made for women have been made on the backs of women of color. The women's movement for equality was not started by women above the line, by dominant women. It was started by women below the line. But then women above the line took it over and ran with it and made it theirs and said to women of color, just as the church people said to Martin Luther King, wait, time will take over it. And Sojourner Truth, who was a Black woman, and one of the ones who started the movement, but when women above the line took off with it, she said, well, what are you doing? Ain't I a woman too? Don't I have rights? What about me? And the answer she got was, we'll get to you. And of course, a little bit later when Susan B. Anthony and everybody else took over, it was the same thing. Do we know why family planning started? Family planning started she wanted to limit the amount of Black children. This was the family planning for Black families, not for women above the line. So what I'm saying here is that the church has made a lot of strides. And I'm talking about this church, the Anglican Diocese. I'm not talking about Christianity. I'm talking about my Anglican Diocese. And it's in specific, I'm talking about the cathedral. It's made a lot of strides. I mean, the cathedral stood up at Synod when other churches didn't say, we're going to recognize a gay marriage, enough for you. They stood up, but polishing the glass ceiling does not make it attainable. Gazing through it can provoke more anger, more fear, more hurt, and more disappointment. You see it, but you can't enter. Or you can't enter that boardroom. It's too small, and the table is too small. You can't sit around the table. Make a bigger table. Make the room larger. Mentor people. Identify. You would make a good manager, or you would make a good CEO, you would make a good primate, you would make a good bishop. You'd make a good deacon, a good archdeacon, a good lay, whatever. Polishing the glass ceiling doesn't make it attainable. And again, it goes through the colonial gaze that you've made it attainable for some, but not others. And gazing through it just promotes anger, fear, hurt, and disappointment. So you go down, you go to the Black liberation theology because they understand what you're saying. They're not saying it's going to take time. They're saying time is now, let's go. So remember, while some people are talking about breaking the glass ceiling, other people are talking about being stuck on the sticky floor. So I'm going to take a look at the chats now. Let's see where we are. Polly Murray is an important woman. Is that exactly? There's a lot of them who've been, yes, Janet. Okay. Yeah, when studying feminist theology, there's a white feminist theology and Spanish feminist, exactly, because they see things through different eyes, Jose. Jennifer said, thanks for pointing out the systemic issues, Daddy. Yeah. Polly Murray is an important, yes, who has been unjustly forgotten. This person, Sojourner Truth, yes. Yes, ain't I a woman too, yes. Oh, Polly Murray is in the Episcopal Church 2013 calendar, someone said. Women who immigrated to Canada as a domestic World War II, who mostly came from Europe, were granted permanent status upon arrival. As soon, as the population, yes, to the global south, the laws were changed. That's right. And they even came up with a white paper on it to make it increasingly difficult for women to attain citizenship. And where was the church standing up for this? Where was the social activism when that was happening? Are we brave enough to speak out what a broken glass ceiling could look like in our diocese? I don't know. That's a question, Graham, that you'll have to discuss among yourselves. I don't know. And there's a movie, I didn't know there was a movie coming out about Paula Murray. Did not know that. Thank you for that. Anyone else want to say anything before we move on? Dion, can you see if there are any hands up or anything?
Yeah, I'd like to say something. You covered an issue I'm part of.
Okay, could you tell me, let me see if I can pull this up so I can see.
Well, I took some notes.
No, I want to see you.
Yeah. Well, I'm a mental health consumer
Okay.
since 1984. Like the civil rights movement, in a way, things have changed in mental health, but not enough.
Mm-hmm.
The stigma of psychiatry from the professional workers in mental health, they
Mm-hmm.
have a stigma, and it's yet to be overcome. And in society itself, what goes on, the stigma of psychiatry of, it's, as I put it with, well, the diagnosis of schizophrenia, I
Mm-hmm.
mean, the color of my mind, gray matter,
Mm-hmm.
supposed to be one of the medical issues with schizophrenia when they analyze the brain after death.
Right.
Okay, the other thing, on, well, the street I'm on, it's predominantly African Canuck population, low to middle income.
Mm-hmm.
And took me in, and well, during the Super Bowl, I think it was 2019, there was a black and white clip, and as I told the men, it's a bit of a prophet. Uh, it was 2019 that a lot of African American football stars were kneeling during the
Yes.
Super
Yes.
Bowl.
With Colin Kaepernick. Yes.
We are not black.
Mm.
And like I told, well, in the African or to Caribbean people I'm around, uh, it's complicated. And I told them, they never saw it. Uh, I always use a person of darker complexion.
Yeah.
Uh, well, black is not a color, it's a shade
Mm-hmm.
as compared to white. And I'm not white, I'm Caucasian.
Mm-hmm.
I'll leave it at that. Give you the floor.
You know, the interesting thing about schizophrenia is that we know literature has shown us, research has shown us, there's a wonderful, wonderful gentleman with whom I'm totally in love. And he's going into retirement. And I said to him, Roland, I don't know what I'm going to do when you go away. But his name is Roland Littlewood. And Roland is a psychiatrist in England. And what we found, and it happens here also, medicine is very biased also. But one of the things we found is that psychiatrists are more inclined to diagnose people of color with schizophrenia than they are those who are assigned above the line, more than the dominant people. We also know that pain medication is often not given to people of color in the same way it's given to people above the line, because the theory was that they could maintain pain more, they could deal with pain better than delicate people above the line, and so they often didn't get the medication that they needed. And in some of the articles that you look at in some of the medical journals will talk about, as I said, this is a systemic problem. You had physicians and others who were saying, well, they're animalistic anyway, and they don't feel pain the same way. And the pain medication wasn't given. Dermatologists, for example, weren't taught about Black skin. And so I can remember in a hospital in which I worked in the city, a mother came in with a child, a Black mother, and the child had what is commonly referred to as Mongolian marks. That's not the technical name for it, but most of you might know it that way. And the resident called social services and said that this child was being abused. The child wasn't being abused. As a matter of fact, these things go away. These marks go away. But that is what happens because this colonial gaze, we see things through those eyes only. And this happens over and over and over again. The algorithms that we put into the computers now that we're looking at big data, the algorithms, I tell my students, garbage in, garbage out. What we get out depends upon what we put in. But if we're putting in that kind of racist mentality about who can feel pain and who's schizophrenic, and we have those ideas planted in our heads when we start putting the data in, that's what we get out. So
May
yes. Go ahead,
Yeah,
Ian.
yeah. It was. I took a note there that history books have to change.
Absolutely. There's
Yeah.
no if, ands, or buts. I've been preaching
And-
about that for years and years. Yeah.
Yeah, and this, and thus medical books have to change.
And we're in the
This
process of
is
doing it. Yeah.
2021, and old Freud does not apply to mental health.
Not anymore. And if he ever really did. If he ever really did. I mean, and you know, and even the philosophy, you look at, as I said, my PhD is in psychology and biomedical ethics. All the philosophers I was taught, you look at Kant. Kant was racist as all get up. You know, but it was poured down our throats. And the thing is, because it's systemic, it gets passed on from one to the other. And when we take it in as people of color, we don't know at the point at that time. And when your professor is telling you these things, you internalize it and you pass it on to your students or whatsoever. So, you know, right now we're looking and we're going through the medical journals. My colleagues and I just published a paper about that we want them to put a disclaimer at the beginning of some articles talking about the historical racism that's in it. We're not saying take them out because we believe that you have to know your history, but we want them to say there are issues in here that are not acceptable. Yes, Graham.
After.
Thanks, Myrna. What I would like to say is that I think it's possible when we look at a glass ceiling to look inside our own organization. And we can look like many other organizations at this time. They're looking for often Black people within their own organization to elevate to other roles that they may not have previously had. I don't know, you know, there's a separate, you would have a wonderful, you could really help us understand the good and the bad of that. I imagine there's some good and some bad with that approach. And we could probably do something like that. Maybe that's happening even already, right? However, when I say glass ceiling, I would actually go back to the first slide that you gave us of Martin Luther King, Dr. Martin Luther King, talking about the disgust that people have with the church.
Yes.
And I would say, you know, you hear phrases like saying the church is the only organization which exists for its non-members, right? We say things like that at conferences.
Yeah, but it's not true.
It's not true, right? It's not true, even if you, especially if you look at the money. Where do we spend our money? We spend our money on the members.
Yeah.
So let's go and talk about who were the members. And what we know is they left the church. They've left the church in greater numbers than ever before in any part of the Christian history, right? And what did they do? They didn't just become wastrels sitting in their house just making money. They've actually gone and founded charities. They're academic leaders. They're out in the world. And I would say glass ceiling number one, broken, would reach those people and say, we are so sorry. We hold some resources here, which we didn't share with you when you left the church. But actually you left the church because of your disgust with what was happening. So we want to hand those resources to you. I'm specifically talking about non-religious registered charities. Number two, and that's why I don't think this is easy, but I think it's simple. The breaking of a glass ceiling in our diocese would look to other churches that are not Anglican. Forget about other religions for a minute, just other Christian religions, and recognize them as co-equals, if not, to be honest, far more effective gospel ministries. Far more effective because they have more people who are following the scriptures more carefully. They're learning, they're growing. We tell them, and we tell each other that our training was better. Therefore, we don't recognize their ordinations. Well, our training wasn't better. It wasn't better by any measure.
Welcome to colonial gaze, my friend.
Yeah, well, I have a master's degree from the London School of Economics in decolonization.
Yeah.
And studied what happened in my father's country in British Guyana. So I've been on the colonial gaze for a long time, and my family has been brought around the world through the colonial gaze, as any Indo-Caribbean person would say. And very different, you know, all of those things. Anyways, that's you understand what I mean by that background. But my number two thing, that's what I really want to underline, and the simplicity of it is, what would it look like to radically recognize, not as renters in our buildings, which is what we do, but as co-equals. And I just finished by giving a very practical example. One of my best friends who began his ministry to what were called traveler people, otherwise known as gypsies in some cases in England. He then went and worked with very difficult youth in North London in the UK. And he found himself in a church in Hounslow, London, right near Heathrow Airport, which is entirely Indian and mostly North Indian. He had every shade of Indian church you could possibly imagine renting the building of his Anglican church. And there are no white people who live in that area.
No,
right?
in Hounslow, no,
So
they're not.
Right? So eventually he went to the bishop with all of these renters. And he said, Bishop, I refuse to call these renters anymore. I demand that you recognize their ordination. And you know what the bishop did? He recognized the ordination of all of them. So I declare it right now. And I've asked, you know, I'm not pointing at Bishop Mary because it's not down to only Bishop Mary here or Archdeacon Robert. It's down to all of us to call for it and say it is unacceptable to declare that Christians of non-Anglican background are less Christian and therefore less deserving of the colonial resources that we have hoarded.
Yep.
So that's it. Thank you very much.
That is wonderful. But hold on to that, because that's one that the final exercise of the day is going to be asking that type of question. So make yourself a note. Okay, Miranda, I see you.
Thank you, Myrna. I just wanted to add another example. When you talked about the Mongolian mark and the threat of child abuse, I know of another story where the mother, she was pregnant, and when they did the ultrasound, they discovered that the African child's nose was flat, and they were wanting to diagnose Down syndrome. And because it wasn't a straight nose.
Yeah, it wasn't simply the colonial gaze. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So just want to throw that in as another example.
Oh, yes, absolutely. We've got to get away. You know, that colonial gaze, it's costing people their lives too.
But you can't diagnose Mongolism by just looking. You have to do tests.
But that's the whole thing. They didn't.
I got it.
This is not about Mongolism. No, it's not Mongolism. That's not what it is. It's called Mongolian marks. A lot of Black babies are born with these slight discolorations of the skin. It goes away. It goes away.
I thought she was talking about the nose.
But that's the point she's making. That when they looked in utero and saw that the child's nose was not aquiline, they decided from the get-go, even before the child was born, that this child was going to have trisomy 22 rather than.
I got it. Thank you.
Am I incorrect in thinking that I saw Myrlie Cumberbatch?
That's me.
Myrlie?
Yes, dear.
How are you?
I'm okay.
I'm happy. I thought I saw your name.
Yeah, I was a little under the weather earlier, but I tuned in after lunch.
It's good to see you. My boy's okay?
So.
Okay. I'm in love with her children, in case anybody wonders what that's all about. Nice to see you, Myrlie.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anyone else? Yes, Ian, yes. Oh, no, it's Roz. Yes, Roz.
Social services and children is a huge issue. And it's one I was involved with recently and had been over a period of time. And there's no question but that there's systemic racism in that system.
Yes. I remember before I started to work at the children. Oh, yeah, you can hear my story after. Other people have things they want to say. I have Taddy, Anne, and Penny. Start with you, Taddy.
Just a little while ago, you mentioned that people needed to be actively thinking, noticing people who would make excellent doctors or bishops or whatever else. What do you do about the fact there's a lot of research that people really underestimate the ability and the performance, both in school and at work,
Yes.
of non-white people. So
Mhm.
they just don't notice if someone would actually make a really good, say, neurosurgeon. What can be done about that?
I think we have to get out of our collective congratulatory cages and to start seeing people as the equivalent of us, rather than continuing with that colonial gaze and saying, these good things can only accrue to people who look like me or who grandma or grandpa have taught me to believe are civilized. I mean, that's what the colonial gaze was all about. It was about civilization, who was civilized and who was not. And it calls for us to make changes in who we are, which is very difficult. Very, very difficult for us to look at ourselves and say, what I've been living is not real. And it's oppressive to other people. That's very painful for us to admit. Without realizing it, I have been an oppressor. And that's very, very difficult. And I think that, it's true. In some ways, we've been talking about above and below the line in terms of pigmentation, in terms of white hegemony and white ideology. But in other areas, we all share things above and below the line. I am above the line in terms of my education, in terms of my status as someone who gets hired to do certain things. That puts me above the line. But it doesn't put me above the line in other areas. But I have to accept that because I'm above the line in this area, I have to look within my student body and say, how are they doing? I like what someone said this morning, that we do learn from our students, and we should be humble enough to recognize that. But someone said, every question a student asks is a learning opportunity for me. And we have to be aware of that, and we have to mentor our students. And I've done that with so many students. I've pulled them along. My late husband was a physician at the Children's, and very often in my classes, I would find a really, really bright person, and I would say to him, first of all, I got him to start taking students, even if they were outside his area of medicine. And I say, this student would be really, really good if you mentored her and taught her something, even if it was only social skills, or him or her. And we've got to start doing that. There are all kinds of ways we can reach out and help, but we've got to stop not pretending. We've got to stop accepting the lie that we're special. That's the first thing. We've got to stop accepting that lie and challenge it. And you need to turn on your.
Yeah,
There you go.
There you are.
I just wanted to fill you in with another story about a Mongolian spot.
Mm-hmm.
Our daughters are adopted, and we lived in Taiwan for a while, so they were adopted in Taiwan. And before we actually signed the papers, we said we wanted to be sure they would be accepted by Canadian immigration. So we took them to the doctor that would be doing their immigration papers. And when he took off one of my daughter's diapers, there was a big black spot on her behind. And I said, oh, was it a forceps delivery? I couldn't think of any other reason why she would have an apparent bruise there. So he explained to me about the Mongolian spot. And that was fine. And we came back home, and quite a while later, I read a story in the paper that, and this was a Chinese family, had gone out for the evening and had a reliable babysitter come in. And when the babysitter changed the diaper, she saw a spot there, assumed it was a bruise, assumed it was maltreatment, and called the Children's Society. And those parents, I gather, had about a week before they could actually get their child back, arguing that this was nothing to do with its treatment at all, but it was a natural occurrence.
Absolutely.
And I was appalled, because you would think in a city, particularly a city that, I mean, this was quite a while ago. My kids are now nearly 50. that you would have thought in a city like Toronto, which had a tremendous variety in their populations, that people working in the children's aid would know of these things. But I guess
you would think.
Anyway, I just thought I would share that with you.
Thank you very much for that. Penny.
Hi. My area of activism has to do with human trafficking. And there's a particular area of concern for me which relates to the cyber sex abuse of children, the vast majority of whom are children of color. And I have been doing some research along with an organization in the UK called the Lucy Faithfull Foundation. And in their studies, they find that perpetrators don't recognize that the harm they're doing to the children, particularly children of color,
that's right,
is as bad. So I don't know what language you want to use. Is as impactful on the children. So if the child is a Black child or an Asian, and the vast majority of these children currently are Asian children.
Yeah.
Simply because of the infrastructure in terms of access to the internet, because the abuse is happening online. So the children are being abused in the Philippines, for example.
Yes.
And the activity is being directed from mostly Canada, the United States, and Germany.
Yes. Yeah.
And so those that have been, brought before the courts, and then also in certain cases are, part of some kind of a program to try and help them recognize the harm that they're doing. This is a very real thing. They do not believe it. They do not believe that these children.
Yeah, I know.
Really hard thing to share.
But I know. And the other thing is, what is particularly heinous to me, I mean, for me, abusing a child is beyond the pale for me. I mean, but grown men, because it's mostly men.
Yes.
Grown men in the so-called civilized world, civilized men, those men above the line, they will leave Canada, the United States, Britain, other places in Europe, and go to Thailand, go to the Philippines and abuse children and use the excuse, well, it's legal there.
Which it's not.
Which it is not. And they'll say that. And they also take advantage of the fact that some of these women are so poor, that because poverty is an issue. It's so poor that sometimes these poor women are forced to sacrifice their children to put food on the table. And they will do these horrible, nasty, disgusting men will do to those children what they would never tolerate anybody doing to their children here. And it comes back to that colonial gaze. Our children are perfect. They're civilized. I can do whatever I want to these other children. And in this instance, the church has spoken out. The church has spoken out. As I say, take your kudos where they are. You have spoken out. But you can't keep just speaking out from inside the church. You've got to get out there on the street. You've got to be active. You've got to do active empathy. Can't just be something that we talk about within four walls. We've got to get out there and get our, as I said last night, Jesus got down and dirty with the multitude. He got his hands dirty. We got to go out there and get dirty. Thank you for sharing
Patricia.
that. Pardon?
Patricia had her hand up.
Oh, sorry, Patricia. Where are you? There you are. Yes, Patricia.
Right, Myrna, thank you so very much. Just a brief memory. And so we all know how faulty memory can be.
Yes.
But anyways, this is a 50-year-old memory when the Faculty of Religious Studies invited James Cone to come and speak to it because it was having a term-long sessions on liberation theology.
Mm-hmm.
And so we were ticking them off, right? We'd done the Marxist, we'd done the woman's liberation theology,
Right.
And now we got to Black liberation theology, and James Cone was invited to come in. Just to say to people that this was at that point stage a theology faculty that was known for its quote unquote liberal ideas. It wasn't thought particularly progressive, but they were liberal.
Right.
And in the theology department, almost everyone was ordained at that point who was a professor. So in walked into the senior common room, a well-appointed room, this very handsome man. He
was, wasn't he? He was. So was George Long and C.T.
Yes,
they were gorgeous men. Yes.
Beautifully dressed, and he came in and he spoke. And I could see that there were an awful lot of my professors whom I adored, who were getting very nervous.
Yeah, they were discomforted.
Very, very nervous. Now it comes, this is my memory of the colonial gaze. These were also men who, having been brought up in middle-class, upper middle-class families, liked to dress down, and certainly were humble enough that they didn't like to pretend or even suggest that they were in any way well off.
But they were.
So at one point, one of my professors, the professor of New Testament, whom I absolutely adored, who I thought was gentle, sweet, kind, generous, I mean, et cetera, looked at Professor Cone and said, you know, Jim, why they were on first name basis, I haven't the foggiest idea. It seems to me that you've got the wrong end of the stick. I mean, I can tell you that from my point of view, the gospel tells us all that you know, we should not be after riches. We should not be after you know, those things that will give us any kind of position in society. And yet everything that you seem to be saying goes that way. And so then there was this awful silence. And I'll never forget this as long as I live, because he stood up and he turned around and he looked at, and he said, Professor Kirby, I will tell you that when you let me be rich, when you let me, and he just went on for at least a good 3-4 minutes. And that has stuck with me my whole life. When I hear you speaking about the colonial gaze, I have been mindful of that. Yeah.
As I said, he was the father of Black liberation theology. He said, you know, enough of this nonsense, and that's what it's all about. And the irony of Kirby, of Professor Kirby coming from his background and talking about God, talking about poverty and not wanting to rise above. Have you looked at yourself? It's totally lost on him. Okay.
Anyhow.
I think I have to move on to the next one. Is there somebody else? No, nobody's hand is up. Okay. Next slide. Go. Did you say something, Dia? Okay. Next slide, please, Deborah. Okay. So, okay, what are we finishing, Dion? At 3:15? When are we finishing?
3:15.
Okay.
I'll tell you 3:10.
Okay, fair enough. So we were talking about women, and we were talking about the colonial gaze. And I want to talk to you about something like cosmetics. Do you know, there's been a lot of papers written about this, and more people, women of color are talking about it. You can't use the shampoo in hotel rooms if you're not living above the line. Because the shampoo that's there is made for the hair of people who've been assigned below the line. That shampoo, the conditioners, everything, it's not made for people like me. So we walk with our own. But here's the thing. Up until a few years ago, even to try to buy a lipstick was a specialty item here in Montreal. And until Rihanna came along, we didn't have all the colors. This young woman from Barbados, she's got something like 80 colors because black doesn't only come in one shade. You see some people who look white and they're black, and the shade is for them, and the chemical makeup is made differently. There's an image on me on the internet, on YouTube. I made a video for the city of Montreal when we worked on the Declaration of Montreal, and they asked me to work with them to make this video. And I said to them, do you have someone who can do my makeup? And they said, yes, yes, yes. They brought this person in. And I said to them specifically, do you know how to do black makeup? Yes, we do. I said, are you sure? Yes. Well, they did this thing. And of course, the makeup was wrong because they used makeup that was made for white people. It turned on and it looks as though I'm in my coffin in this thing. So I made a point of getting the thing buried. And I told them they were not to use it. So when we could get makeup, it was more expensive. Now we can get hair products in stores. We had to fight like the devil to get hair products for people of color. At one point, you went to get your picture taken at Costco, and they did not adjust the background for Black people and other people of color. You look like a blob. So my sister and I, and some of my other Black friends, we had one card and we called it the Universal Black Card, because it was this blob and they couldn't tell who was on the darn thing. Here, and so we're talking about the colonial gaze, hair and hairstyles. Even today, women of color and boys of color are being told they can't wear their hair in natural hairstyles in the workplace. A couple of years ago, it was the big thing down at the Madison restaurant down on Sherbrooke Street across from the Botanical Gardens, where the boss said to that lady, you can't come in here unless you're wearing a wig, unless your hair looks like a Caucasian lady's wig. That's the image I'm selling. Her mother was a hairdresser. Her mother did her hair. You saw the pictures of it. She looked beautiful. The judge eventually gave her money. It had to go to court several times. It was a big thing. It was all over BBC. And yeah, even got to the BBC in England, but it was certainly all over CBC here. But here, an identity. Here is part of the identity of Black people. One of the things that was done with the braiding in Black hair, when people were trying to escape enslavement, is that the paths, you see all those winding things in Black people's hair, it's not just aesthetics. Part of it was showing the route, how to get out. It was one way to hide your intentions from the master and the mistress. They see, and the hairstyles before the middle passage told people what your status was in your society, what tribe you came from. The patterns meant something. All of that was taken away once you were put into that boat, because everybody was thrown in. So hair and hairstyles are an important part of people's identity, the emotional, visually, historically. And when you go up to people and say, can I touch your hair? I don't know which, Austin Clarke, who's a famous Barbadian writer, the late Austin Clarke, talks about when he was given the Giller Prize. And somebody looking through white gaze, through colonial gaze, he made some comment about, the Africanness of his hair. And I mean, read some really disparaging remarks. And he said, up until the time he won the Giller Prize, these Caribbean writers were not seen as Canadian. They were always said Caribbean writers, and they were only supposed to write about Caribbean things. And it took him winning the Giller Prize for somebody to say, oh, a Canadian writer won it. But until he won the Giller Prize, he was not allowed to enter into the prestigious beams of being a Canadian writer. Even though he taught at University of Toronto, had been here for years and years and years, he was a Canadian, but he was always seen as a Caribbean writer who was only supposed to write Caribbean things. So the colonial gaze is a really dangerous thing. It hurts people. It raises people's blood pressure. It creates mental health difficulties, does all kinds of things, and it even attaches things like cosmetics, for goodness sake. Next slide, please, while you're doing. So here it is. This is real, people. L'Oreal Paris makes this product. It's called White Perfect. Tells you everything you need to know right now. And look at the subtitle, Melanin Vanish. It's a cream that's made to bleach the skins of Black and brown people so that they can get as close as possible to White Perfect. If you doubt me, go online, you can order it. This cream is sold mostly in Black and brown, predominantly Black and brown countries. So you'll find it in India, you'll find it in Asia, in China, in Japan, you'll find it in Africa, you'll find it in Brazil, you'll find it in the Caribbean. Predominantly Black and brown people buy this cream, are encouraged to buy this cream because they're being seen through the colonial gaze, which has determined that White Perfect, above the line, that horizontal line of which I spoke, the dominant group is the group that sets the hegemony, that sets the aesthetics, that sets everything. It's that line that we want to eradicate. We want to erase that line and get rid of these kinds of products. Next slide, please. So before I go any further, I'll take a quick look at the chat. See where we are. Patricia, yes, we did that. Human trap, First Nation, a disproportionate. Yes, that's right. That's right. Yes, they go to the Dominican Republic. Thanks for that, Paula. This is a big problem. Looking to see if anything is directed at me. That Alex, I'm a speech language pathologist. My work is on number of children of color in schools. So yes, disruptive in the classroom, much more likely to be assumed. That's right. I'm much less likely to, that's right, to be evaluated with autism, learning disorders, and other difficulties than their white peers who behave in similar ways. So they're much less likely to get the help they need and are more likely to be disciplined. This is something we've known for a long time and that Black parents have been complaining about for a very long time. Yes, human track. Thank you, Patricia. Amazing. Black hair and teen Vogue. Okay. There are many skin cream. Yes, marketed to lighten skin shade. Absolutely, Chris. Absolutely. As I said, most of these creams are sold in Black and brown countries, in predominantly Black and brown countries. Thank you. The importance of full representation. Remember earlier we talked a little bit about imagery and Black and James Golden said, I'm here to tell people that the Black Christ is important, that you worship the Black Christ. Well, Melvin Van Peebles died last week. And Melvin Van Peebles was one of the first Black directors who really tried to get people to see Black actors and actresses as more than Step and Fetch It. And he wrote the famous Sweet Daddy, Sweet Back. And the night he died, his son, Mario, who's also a director, was being interviewed. And he said, you know, the first thing that sets your mind free are images telling you you can do it. And that's what his father tried to do, Melvin Van Peebles. He said, the first thing that sets your mind free are images telling you you can do it. If you live above the line, you can spend your life ignoring the others. And the others can become invisible to you because it's not your reality. Peggy McIntosh talks about how you can live your whole life if you live above the line and never even have to interact with people below the line. You can turn on this TV and see people who look like you. You know that when people are talking about they are good, they are this, that they're talking about your group. You never have to worry when you go to rent an apartment if they're going to say to you, oh, well, there's a Black heaven and a white heaven, or the apartment's already rented, or what have you. If you live above the line, the others can become invisible. If you live below the line, that's not an option that's open to you. You can't ignore those above the line unless you isolate yourself to the point where you almost become segregated. You can't, because things have been set through the colonial gaze, and because it has been set by a dominant group, you live with that. You know, there's one writer, Gross Fugel, talks about how you're always in the position of trying to appease those above the line. And I have to tell you that, and we saw this with the women's movement too, when women started to say, I want this, I want this, I want my rights. A lot of men started to talk about, you know, women are messing with their testicles, and said that women are this and that, and women should know their places. Well, you see the same thing with people of color. And say, oh, that's reverse discrimination. You want the same things, and I can't get a job, and I have, my son has merit, or my daughter has merit, and meritocracy has never been the issue. Because we know that when you look at these things through colonial gaze, the old boys network worked really, really well for people above the line. We know that. It was not totally merit. That's a lie. But we dragged it out when we started talking about reverse discrimination. But you know what? Reverse discrimination does not exist. It cannot exist. I'm not saying that Black and brown people cannot be racist. Obviously they can, but reverse discrimination cannot exist because this is an issue of power. And it only became a thing when BIPOC people started claiming their spaces and their spots. Up until then, when the Old Boys Network was in vogue, when they were getting everything without even thinking about the sticky floor, nobody was talking about reverse discrimination. So if it was reverse discrimination now, why was it not reverse discrimination when it was going on before, and those above the line were profiting and those below the line were not? Why did no one say, hey, this is reverse discrimination here? We're getting stuff that they're not. No one said that. It only became an issue when people were forced to do some introspection, when people were forced to say, I have everything and these others have nothing, and I have to be prepared to build a bigger table. Not grant people their rights. You can't grant people the rights. The rights are there. Rights are not infinite. Just build a bigger table. Next slide, please. So what does it mean to be inclusive? Okay, I'm going to teach you two concepts you may or may not know. The concept of cultural humility and cultural safety. If you're going to be inclusive, you have to actively promote safe, diverse, and respectful places. You have to incorporate abilities, ethno-diversities, religions, sexualities, genders, all of those things have got to be your concern if you're going to be inclusive. You don't get to include a little bit and leave out the rest of the intersectionalities. Where you want to get is to create cultural safety. But before you can get there, you have to develop cultural humility. And what that means is, remember the exercise we did this morning wasn't about the church, it was about you. Acknowledge our own biases, introspection, and being willing and open to recognize that we don't know, regardless of what the colonial gaze has preached. Be willing to recognize that we don't know, that you don't know, and then learn what it is that we don't know, and then apply what we have learned. This is hard work. This calls for a lot of critical thinking. It's not, you can't stop at concrete thinking. You have to get into the abstract. You have to do active empathy. This is hard work to develop cultural humility. And then once you've done that, then you can create a culturally safe space. And the concept of culturally safe space comes from the Maoris in New Zealand. When, the Maori nurses and the Maori tribes got, and they said, no, please, you can't come in here and just take over our lives. You can't come in here and dictate. You can't come in here and just look at it through your colonial gaze. You have to create culturally safe spaces. And it's an environment which is safe in all aspects for the person with whom you're interacting. And if I don't feel safe, I'm not going to interact with you. The space doesn't have to be a physical space. The receiver, the person, defines whether or not that space is safe for them, not the person who's conferring the cultural safety. And I use the word conferring advisedly, really deliberately, I use it because we have this beneficent attitude sometimes, and which leads into condescension very often. So it's the person who's receiving it who determines if that space is safe for them, not the person who's conferring it. Is it, the question they're asking is it safe for me to share my me, my essence, my soul, my being, my everything, what I am, who I am, my fears, my anxieties, my love? Is it safe for me to share that with you? That's the question. And one of the things we have to learn to do is to stop talking. Stop coming up with an answer why the person is still talking. We get so ahead of ourselves. We only hear the first part because we've got an answer ready. We want to go into the defensive mode. Stop talking and listen. Stop merely hearing and internalize what is being said. This is not about confidentiality. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about safety. Am I safe with you? My question is not, are you hearing me when I'm talking to you? If we're in this situation, my question is, are you listening? Are you internalizing? Can you hear me? Can you feel me? That's the question. And I determine whether I feel safe with you, not you determining whether I should feel safe with you. Next, please. So I want to talk to you then, given all that, about some of the, I call it survival skills of people of color, of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Very often they feel they have to protect the feelings of representatives of the oppression. And as I said to you earlier, people will say, I'm not going to spend money on 3 sessions teaching, looking after their feelings and teaching them. That's not what I want to do with my money. I want help. So I want somebody who looks like me, who understands my history. I want to go to a church where they understand what I'm talking about, where the reverend understands me. I don't want to be looking after you anymore. They learn, don't be the angry, I wrote Black here, but don't be the angry Indigenous person. Women had to learn, don't be the angry female, because you're going to get judged. Oh, she's hysterical. So don't be the angry, fill in your adjective there. Don't be the angry that person. You're constantly having to develop strength just to keep going from one day to the other. Fanon talks about the mask. That mask becomes so heavy, so very, very heavy. Your jaw hurts from smiling when really what you want to do is be enraged or cry or what have you. You develop the strength. You're constantly working on developing the strength to get going. I work with some teenagers, want to know about school progress. And some of the kids said they went to church. And I said, oh, you're religious? He said, no, we're not religious. We go to church to ask God to ask for the strength, not to knock somebody's head off so that I can reach my goal, so that I can finish school and get to be the teacher or the singer or the engineer or the doctor. That's why I go. Not because I believe, but and they were talking about the traditional church there, but they can go to the Black Liberation Theological Church and they can talk about these issues there. They can talk about it to the person sitting in the seat next to them. They don't have to sit there and be quiet all the time. They can testify. They can go down in the church hall after and say, oh, you won't believe what kind of a week I have. And somebody will say, hallelujah, tell me about it. You have to teach your kids tactics and strategies, as we've talked about before, which increases intergenerational trauma. One thing you better do is establish those credentials quickly, because the colonial gaze is not seeing you as the holder of knowledge, as the person who's come there to do the teaching. You're there to learn what they think you can pick up. As someone said, we put these kids into remedial classes right off the bat. You have to smile and forgive. Always smiling, always forgiving. Your face gets to hurt, to reduce personal tension and anxiety. You have to look around and make sure that everybody in that sphere is comfortable. Keep the tension down. Be careful using the word white. You don't want to use that word too much because you don't want people to get upset and say, oh, you're being racist, you're attacking us. You're very careful about using that word. And don't correct racists in public, especially at friendly gatherings. So someone says something, you don't want to say, oh, that's really racist. Because you know that you're probably going to be the one who wears it. You're going to be told, did you know that you embarrassed so-and-so? No one's asking if you were embarrassed. No one's saying this was violence against you. You're being told to look after them. You embarrassed Mr. or Mrs. So-and-so by calling out their racism. How could you? And these are some of the survival skills that people of color go through. I mean, I even heard, and I swear to you, I said this to Dion before yesterday. I heard somebody yesterday talking about this in the Truth and Reconciliation. A lady was talking, and she was talking about these very, very, very same things. And she says, I'm tired. I'm so tired. Next slide, please. Okay, go back one, please, Deborah. This is going to be, and so I want to go to the chat before we go to our last. Okay, we have to go into our next exercise. I want to look quickly and see if there's anything that I need to do in creating spaces of culture in order to give a sense of reality, of safety in context of so much history. Yeah, exactly. Given that as a privileged boss, I feel the same insecurity about whether I'm safe and accepted in any church session. I cannot imagine what it feels like to someone of another culture. Thank you for that. I want to bring up quickly something, and I apologize to this person. I don't remember your name. I didn't bring it up. Please forgive me. You mentioned that as a transgendered, I think you said transgendered person, that how difficult it is for you to be always being the one to stand up for yourself when you are aggressed.
Yeah, that's me.
And that you would like it. You like it when someone else from that same grouping comes to your rescue and says, you can't talk to that person like this. This is unacceptable behavior. And how hard it is that you're always having to fight that battle by yourself. And what you're asking for essentially is active empathy. That's what you're saying. As George said last night, say you acknowledge the land as much as you want, but what's it going to do if you're not doing anything about it? Tell me you acknowledge your privilege, so what? And what this person is saying is, see me as an equal. Stand up for me. Don't leave me alone. Don't tell me you love me and you welcome me in the church and isn't it marvelous, but say nothing when people aggress me, aggress my transgenderness. I mean, what is that? So thank you for saying that, and forgive me that I didn't bring it up before. I apologize.
No worries, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Alex. So let's go to the next one, and here's your last exercise. Okay, basically the same as the last one. Now I want you to identify 3 structural things. In other words, systemic things that can be changed, that the church as an institution must do to bring about full EDI, both figuratively and literally in its practice. Mr. Singh earlier talked about some of the things about recognizing other people's ordination. Concrete things is what I'm looking for. Now, you're going to be going off to synod at the end of the year. My advice to you, for what it's worth, is to have something concrete when you go there that you can say, these are the things, these are some things that we want to see. So right now, I'm asking you to look at, identify within your groups 3 structural things that the church as an institution must do to bring about full EDI, both figuratively and literally in its practice. See you back here at what, 5 past?
So that's giving 15 minutes. Please
Unless
note that
people are willing to stay until 3:20. In which case
okay.
I can go to 3:10. It's up to people.
Okay, perfect. So I'm putting the timer on this time. Please note that you are in different groups this time. So enjoy.
Exercises in the chats.
Okay, so let me read to see if I missed any of this. Yes, Deborah, you're right. Oh. Let's see. Yes, Bob. Most whites are looking forward to tanning and having a darker skin because they know it comes off. Literally invisible. In Nunavut, I kept finding myself introducing Inuit whom my knowledge had not noticed were present. Oh my goodness gracious. There's a paper, there's an article in the Washington Post, and it's called "The Mothers of Gynecology's Monument Remembers Enslaved Women Who Endured Experimental Surgery." The statue of a doctor who experimented on enslaved women still stands in Alabama, the guy who came about with gynecology. But now there's also a monument to his victims. These women were made to kneel on their hands and knees while he probed them without anesthesia and pulled at their insides in order to map the inside of the human body and create the science of gynecology. And these women were never recognized. I mean, those of us in the medical community knew it, but these women were never recognized. So I'm glad to see that that's happening. So I just want to tell you that.
Okay, so I'll call out the groups as we go. So group 1, this group had Alex, Amy, Andrew, Angela, Dale, David, and Deborah. Could someone from, and Jose, and other people, could someone report from that group, please? Group
yes,
1.
I think it's me.
Thanks.
So yeah, we had a broad conversation. We talked about the need just for continued education within sermons, within Sunday school, just to build awareness of the history and working for inclusion and equity in the future. And as part of that, sort of asking newcomers to the community what support they need. We talked about church practices and protecting, especially liturgy, and protecting a space for cultural expression and diversity within liturgy. We talked about how the dominant group can be blind to diversity even within their own community, and a need to know each other more deeply, and sort of be aware of the diversity that's there. We talked about how Zoom has been a tool to kind of connect with others within your community, but also outside the community. And there's a church that's that has a relationship with the Diocese of the Territory of the People, and how Zoom has become a way to be in relationship with people in Indigenous communities that are very geographically distant, but a way to connect. And then there's a suggestion to look about where we put our money, giving an example of a Baltimore church who had realized they had much of their endowment was from slave owners. And so they were giving away to support organizations that supported the Black community in Baltimore. And so just a need to look at our history and look at that history, and for that to be followed up with how we use our resources as churches.
Thank you. Room number 2 had Camille, David, Deborah, Gail, Linda, Marilyn, Merle. Someone from that group report in, please.
Yeah, that's me. So we ended up with more than 3 things. So the church needs to acknowledge that there is a problem. We need to identify specific times where we did wrong. We need to educate our communities about that and educate that as a church body, we need to be able to own up for when we did wrong and try to fix it. We need to look at the ethnic makeup of our churches and look at how that's actually being represented on different levels. We need to amend the canons for anti-discriminatory practices. We need to listen to anti-racism groups and committees. We need to ask people predominantly below the line what they think needs to be made, changes. We need to give them a voice and then actually listen and follow through on what they say. Yeah, we need to build a bigger table, and we need to remember that the core work of the church is social justice.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks, Sarah. Breakout group number 3. So that had Carol Johnson, Jessica Bigford, Rosalind McGregor, Wendy McCullough. Could someone from that group please report in? Chris Bell.
Carol said she would.
And Carol's there. Perfect.
There's Carol.
If you want to unmute yourself.
Carol, you're muted.
There we go. Sorry, I thought I'd done that. We talked about the differences in communities and the differences in churches, and that even within a small church, within an all-white church, it's important to have icons around the church that do reflect the community, so that everything from the Holy Family to the angels to the saints to biblical stories, everything is not a white face as part of those pictures, and how that could be included in bulletins, on the front cover of bulletins as well. Someone mentioned the importance of knowing something about human anthropology. There was quite a discussion about hiring practices, particularly at the diocesan level, that it needed to be tracked. And tracked meaning in terms of gender, in terms of race, in terms of salaries, in terms of, instead of just looking at who is graduating this year, where can we put them, but really doing some serious tracking in terms of looking at what the practices have been. There was a question about have there been Black priests in white communities? Knowing that the other in reverse does happen, and questions like, is this parish ready for a female priest? Apparently that's a consideration as well. In smaller churches, in terms of sending people to synod or sending people on various jobs, sometimes it's whoever would show up. And people who live farther from the city, it's often an issue of who is able to drive, who is willing to drive. Mm-hmm. Sometimes when there's a certain limited number of families, things get contained within those families, but it's important to ask above. And something that was kind of interesting that came up toward the end was, as well as inviting others in the neighborhood, in the community, to join us for different events and having community events non-church related in that sense, but also to asking, may we join your table? And going in the other way, that if we're not getting people in, or there's something going on, saying, may we be part of your event. That was pretty well it.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Getting the snaps from me and Myrna.
Oh yeah, snaps. Yeah.
Let's go breakout group number 4. So that had Chris Barger, Janet, Jean, Jim, Karen, Nick, Patricia, Penny, Ron, Vivian. Could someone report in from that group, please?
Okay, as succinctly as I can. I think most of our group's discussion was focused on dismantling what we would call colonial structures or practices. So whether of the Anglican Communion worldwide, and why it is the Archbishop of Canterbury is the one who convenes this church, and also similar structures within this diocese. So breaking down to little things like whether at the diocesan office we need all those portraits of the old white men who were bishops over the years. In our parishes, whether clergy need to wear all their vestments, which tend to create a separation between them and laypersons in the church. Whether there are new structures that we would create that would be focused on enabling mission rather than maintaining power in the pyramid that we've created.
Yeah, you like that? Yeah.
I saw your fingers going.
Oh, yeah.
We even talked a little bit about whether we can wean ourselves off some of our financial resources, including something like the Anglican Foundation, which may also reflect some of the wealth that we've accumulated because of our position. We also asked whether we are culturally humble enough, whether we still have some things to learn, whether we could pay attention to what Douglas John Hall said decades ago about being part of a disestablished church. So what that structure would look like was a lot of our discussion. We also mentioned the possibility of trying to include some French in every Anglican service in this diocese, even in places where there might be just one or two Francophones who are present. What might it be like to hear a little bit of the liturgy in one's language, or to speak to the wider community about some of this? I mentioned too, from our Lutheran experience, there are some congregations in our denomination not ready to have female clergy or LGBTQ plus clergy. And I know that it's not helpful to kind of force that, but trying to step into that door and perhaps initiating some conversation would be a dream of mine for those who negotiate calls in our parishes. So that's most of ours, I think.
Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Jim.
I like where you're going there.
Merci beaucoup. On va procéder à le groupe numéro 5. Cet groupe avait Bethany, Brian, Bruce, Gabriel, Jane, Jean-Jacques, Margaret. Peut-être quelqu'un pour cet groupe pour faire un reportage, s'il vous plaît. Allez-y.
C'est moi le rapporteur et je vais répondre en anglais si... Si ça vous convient, je peux faire en français aussi. So there were several kind of practical suggestions. One was that the churches take some of the proceeds from the increasing number of property sales that are occurring and use at least part of that money to support things like groups with whom we're in solidarity, for example, Indigenous peoples that are fighting for land rights. So in other words, back up, our rhetoric around land acknowledgements with, something actually concrete, which, somebody alluded to, I think before lunch, might actually cost us or hurt us. Otherwise there may not be a lot of, meaning to the words. Working in the very kind of thing we're doing today in some form in our overall catechesis. So as we form disciples within the church, work reflections and teaching on racism of different kinds into baptismal, confirmation, ordination, preparation. There's obvious links, I think, to make between that and our baptismal covenant, especially around loving your neighbor as yourself and respecting the dignity of every human being. So just drawing those lines a little more clearly. There was a desire expressed in our group to acknowledge that the Anglican Church has been moving in a positive direction on some of this stuff. And our gathering today is proof of that, and last night. Yet at the same time, also an acknowledgement that there's still lots of work to do. And one of the ways that work could be done is, especially local congregations, trying to bridge that divide. A lot of our churches have become kind of destination churches and have lost some of the connection to the actual communities in which they're physically embedded. And so what would it look like to reestablish connection with place? With a specific focus on equality, continuing and maybe deepening the church's work around housing security, food security, all the different groups of people who exist on the margins, because there's pretty much not a group within our society that doesn't have individuals who need that kind of help. So focusing once again on helping people in need, and also a critique of the current form and content of theological education and ministerial formation, described by one person in our group as antiquated. And so is there, and antiquated in such a way that it doesn't respond necessarily to the needs of the church and the world sufficiently anymore, and that there's other models already out there that the church could follow, so that we could make safer places for people to be heard, and in that way become concretely more inclusive.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bruce. All right, so that was group. All right, so let's go to group 6. So Bertrand, Merlene, Eldemara, Edward, Holly, Jean-Fils, Bob, Susan. Someone from that group pop in?
Sure, as briefly as possible. Structurally, we need to push vocations equally across different backgrounds and not just favor one form of education, but respect that there are different ways to be educated in different forms of education to create a more equitable situation. We need to work with other churches, not just the Anglican Church, but have an ecumenical outreach. We need mandatory training for those, like the United Church does. This is what we need to follow in their footsteps and have that. Somebody mentioned that she missed church one Sunday and a priest checked in on her, and that made all the difference. It made her a lifelong devotee. And this needs to be an intentional thing from the top down, welcoming people, greeting people, getting to know their names, getting to learn about people. Welcoming. It's just a very huge thing. Somebody else pointed out that she's familiar with a community in the north. They're allowed to worship in Cree and they hold their services, but they're only allowed to have like communion twice a year with a certain kind of priest who has a certain kind of education who comes in, and this needs to be addressed, and we're hoping that we can fix this. And also there's the issue that other people have been talking about, religious art. Something has to be done to create a sense of diversity. Art is so important, and we cannot underestimate the power and the value of art. Thank you.
Grazie mille. Let's move on to group number 7. So we had Ben, Heather, Ian, James Bouchard, James Bennett. Could someone from that group check in, please?
Yeah, so we talked about how we recognize and identify vocations at the parish level and beyond. So thinking about how the kind of the inherited biases and maybe the assumptions of what people are capable of will color who we might be looking at when we're thinking about vocations to the priesthood or the diaconate. Examining our nomination process. So thinking of church governance, both the parish level, the diocesan level, general synod, who is getting elected, how are we identifying, how are nominating committees selecting people, and also addressing the fact that there might be reluctance or hesitance on the part of perhaps people of color to put themselves forward for leadership positions. And so how are we empowering and encouraging and making it clear that these are voices that we want and need. We want your voice. We want to hear your voice. We want you at the table. So looking at nominations. And then we talked about representation in art, which has been come up before. So again, like who do we see when we look at the painting, stained glass, hear the stories in our churches, and how diverse is that representation?
Thanks, Ben. Group number 8, if we can bring in someone from that group.
Yes,
Grace.
I'm reporting for that group.
Thank you.
Okay, we talked a lot about new people. How do we not scare them off, bring them in gently, listen to them, show cultural humility with our newcomers. We want to bring them in gently, don't force them into major roles right away. Don't push them off a glass cliff and make them warden in the first year. Be ready to interpret what we do to people who don't understand it. Be ready to mentor them as they move into the community. Be sensitive about how fast they want to move. We looked at the ordination process. We want to make sure that it doesn't embody exclusion by race or class at any point. Also to require committees involved in this process to have anti-racism training so they don't inadvertently project bias onto new candidates. And inform candidates adequately that they are going out into the world, which is a racist playing field. And whatever their own racial identity, this is going to affect them and they need to know about it. We also talked about broadening the concept of ministry. Are there areas where we could minister to the wider community with either ordained or lay people that we haven't identified or defined yet? Educational support for Sunday schools and youth groups to teach people about diversity, about racism, about inclusion, and obviously depending on the child's own racial identity, that they need to learn either to expect and address racial discrimination or maybe to help their friends stand up to it. Where are we now? A strong need for cultural humility and listening. The historical church has had a huge superiority complex which needs to disappear. And we need to do a lot more listening. And I think this is basically it. Thank you.
That was brilliant.
Thank you.
Okay.
Dion, you're muted. You're muted, Dion.
Here's me, group 9. So that's Robert Miller, Sheena Gourley, Maria Abate. Someone from that group hop in, group 9.
Yep, I am the scribe for that group. I will try and summarize what was a very interesting conversation. Number 1, important question: what resources are we putting to this issue? And resources was talked about in terms of space, money, properties, people. Linked to that is, sharing of space, sharing of resources, sharing in a way which is a sharing between equals and not a kind of top down. So not about renting the space to others, but in fact, the space being with everybody, belonging to all the people who are using it. So that's sort of internal to the groups that are using the space, but also in terms relative to the larger community. Ask that question: who's the most on the margins in our particular community, wherever that is geographically? And how could we reach out to them? And how can we work with others, as I said, in this equal web-like approach rather than top-down? Third question, what is realistic in our specific communities? And linked to that, I think, is a very important question. Do we shut down and restart? I'll just maybe add a footnote here. Shutting down is a way to shut down, not to shut down old ways of doing things and do things differently. Um, what are we doing to, let's see, and number 4, what would it look to deal with the financial aspect of this? This is, which really talks, the financial aspect, you know, because there's always an aspect which is financial for these things. And so and sharing that kind of resource is often the hardest to do. Maybe shutting down and starting again is the best way to kind of, you know, rethink that. And the other structural thing is doing away with the clergy-lay divide. I hope that summarizes. And if anybody in my group would like to add or subtract anything, please do.
Thanks, Sheena. So that's group 9. Group 10. So that had Deborah, Carla, Neil. Could someone from that group pop in?
Yeah, that's me, Dion. That's Bill.
Thank you.
We talked about in a parish structure the power and responsibility that you have to be intentional about filling those power positions, that you have to take, say specifically, where we're going to have representative from the white, representatives from color, men and women, English and French, and be intentional about it. Just don't sit around and wait for see who's going to show up. That you have to go out and intentionally and actively invite people in. You know, give them an opportunity, offer them something, ask people how they would like to contribute to the church. Don't necessarily squeeze them in to that established power structure. Be flexible about that. Be conscious about church activities, that when you're creating an activity, make sure that there's some diversity in there. That if you have a book club, you could have a nice book club and study a book written by an African author or an Indian author or a Caribbean author. So that kind of thing. We talked about the arts and how arts can have an effect. People have mentioned icons. We talked about music and how music is very effective for people, affects people, and be open to different types of music and different types of expressions from all around the world, and have a desire to be open, want to be open, and say, yeah, we want to see how the rest of the world operates and how they worship. I think that's the main points for us.
Thank you, Bill. Group number 11, Denis, Frezia, Gwenda, John, Karen, Michel. Someone?
Me again, so Michel Gagnon. So I'll try to cover points which weren't covered by previous groups. One thing that we seem to have a few good communities, or communities that could be served as an example, and well, maybe we could try to see what works there and export the model. One case, not in Montreal, by the way, I mean, maybe where they seem to have the right balance between multicultural acceptance and presence also, LGBTQ and whatever thing, and they do their service bilingually, and things seem to work well. Well, what makes it work? Do they have special kind of people? Do they have a special mixture or what? And maybe there's a recipe that could work elsewhere. And yet even from there, there's an example of a difficulty that was raised at some point. Well, some people, when they decided to be more inclusive, some people decided, we could say, the anglophone pur et dur, the hardcore, decided to move away. They had that luxury in a way. So they only were left with what? Anglophone impur et mou, or what? I'm not sure exactly how we could characterize them. Another example is Common Praise has is a very good book, but try to find hymns for, let's say, an African priest that came at some point and, well, didn't recognize the music because, well, nothing from, no, I don't know, his Zaire or Rwanda, whatever place he was from before that. Maybe not the most interesting also for kids. Someone said there's very few hymns in foreign languages, and it's hard to see that in Quebec, where the official language is French, well, it is considered a foreign language and not the most frequent one in common praise. So that's a problem there. Images, inclusive images, what does it mean? The white Christ, as we could say, has something good also, in that it means that people made it theirs. Now, should we go to be totally authentic and say, well, the Christ must be an Arabic person, or should we go broader and say, well, let's have not only white Christ, but also Chinese Christ, Arabic Christ, and African Christ, and go on that way. At the same time, well, there are limits to the representation. Can Christ himself be a man, a woman, a genderless person at the same time? Or, well, where do we stop? But let's not forget that Christ himself was inclusive throughout all his ministry. Sometimes we see in people, no, I'll go over that. No, it's important actually. Sometimes, well, we want to do too much in a way that looks almost like a cartoon. Oh, I accept you because you're gay. Well, in spite of you being gay or something like that. Well, is that a message of inclusivity, or is that a message that we're not inclusive? And sometimes we do things like that. So we have to be careful in the way we do that. At the same time, we cannot impose change. Yet, if we do nothing, we're going in the wall. And I could draw a parallel. Let's say plants grow, and I can put fertilizer, water, and whatever. But if I pull on a plant, it won't grow. And therefore, we could and we must commit ourselves to be inclusive spaces, which is both essential to survive. And I saw someone who said, Deborah, I think, who said, well, we have 100,000 Spanish speakers in Montreal. Yeah, we also have 1.2 million Francophone speakers in Montreal. Out of 85 ridings outside of the island of Montreal, there's 75 or 80 with less than 5% Anglophone population. So that's, and I can tell you cities where the second minority or the first minority is Arabic because they have 0.5% of them. So we, in a way, we have to do inroads. We have tried, but did we try not hard enough or not the right way or all of them? Good question. And examples that were named is, well, look at the names of our churches. How do you attract people to a place like St. George's 'S Christ Church rather than Saint Ephrem or something like that? Training youth in the church. Well, the Sunday school model, for example, doesn't work with our French community. We seem to have a problem adapting it to make a proper Eucharist that would be proper, yet would do the training in the service at the same time. That's something that would work, yet it's hard to do. It seems to, would it make the Eucharist less interesting or what? I'm not sure exactly, but it seems to be the challenge. Training of priests in French, it seems to be like a special program even in Montreal. Now, how can we get more Francophone? leaders if it seems to be a special program at the same time. And just to answer one final thing, what I've seen at some point, if you go in the Roman Catholic Church, not that much in Montreal, but especially away from Montreal, you have lots of Black priests in Anglophone, in white congregations, because, for instance, the Diocese of Rimouski is, I think, it's have about 2/3 of priests coming from Africa. They are lacking local priests. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. Myrna?
Yeah, I just want, Michelle, thank you so very much. I mean, thank you, all of you, for all the points you've made, and they're wonderful. I just want to say one thing at the risk of, I don't want to offend anyone, but just remember that what I forgot to mention is that when we praise people for saying, oh, your English is very good, or your French is very good, or quoi que ce soit, n'oublie pas that for people who were enslaved, these are all colonial languages. It's Portuguese, French, Dutch, Germans, because the Germans were in Africa also. These are all colonial languages. Don't forget that. So I just want to put that out there, that we have to take all of these things into consideration. We do need to look at how, I never understood why we don't use more French in the class, in the churches in Montreal. It's never made sense to me. My sister dit, n'oublie pas that they're all colonial languages, and be careful how we talk about these with people. We have to recognize their pain from colonialism also. Just saying that. Deborah, could you please show the last slide before Bishop Mary does her benediction? Did I lose Deborah?
Let me look for Deborah. If it's not, then I'll have to find
That's
it.
the last slide. This is what I want to show you. Remember, we did before equality, equity, and then we talked about what we want to go. Yes, we want to remove that barrier, but we want to move it through what you've been talking about in this last session, empowerment. So we've gone from equality. We saw what that looks like. It doesn't work. We've gone to equity, which is better. But what if we remove the line altogether and go to empowerment? That's what we want to do. We want to give these folks at the end, we want to empower them. We want to, and I think we should also avoid using words such as we want them to do that, because it still sends a message of superiority. What if we said we need them, or we would like to work à leur côté? As I said last night, if you want to be an ally, walk next to, take hands, ask them what they need. Avoid saying, we want you to do this, or, you will not. Let's treat people like equals. That's all I'm saying. Yes, Roz, you're right. In this, I didn't create it, Roz. You're absolutely right. Every time I look at it, it's the best I can find to get across the point I wanted with the empowerment, but your point is well taken. Maybe I should get a graphic artist to do it and take ownership of it. But yes, you're absolutely right. Thank you very much. Is everybody okay before Bishop Mary does the...
We'll let Bishop Mary do, and then we'll ask. Go ahead.
Where is Bishop Mary? Oh, there she is.
Oh, I'm here. I'm here. Myrna, I know that there's lots of chat thanking you, people who've had to leave and had other commitments, but we are all really grateful to you for what you've given to us today, for starting us off in a common conversation about racial justice, equity, diversity, inclusion. And I want to thank everybody who made time today to be here, and especially those of you who've now stayed 50 minutes longer than we promised it was going to take. Thank you for your presence and your commitment and your hearts for what is right and good, and for what is God honoring and gospel honoring. And I'm proud of all of you for your involvement and your participation, even though the clergy were told they had to come.
They were voluntold, were they?
Yeah, they were. And this is really an important venture for all of us. And we need to be good at encouraging each other to keep on working at this, to keep on growing and developing. I have a prayer to close with, and then I'm going to bless us.
Okay.
And it's a prayer for Racial Justice Sunday, which the Archbishop of Canterbury and Anderson Jeremiah, a member of their anti-racism task force, the Archbishop's anti-racism task force, wrote. You will be interested to know, friends, that if you go to Anglican.ca, our own Anglican Church of Canada website, and search out racial justice or racism, that there are some resources. We have been working at this. I think I saw stuff since 2000 contributions, but we have to keep learning. This is like what Justice Murray Sinclair said, is truth and reconciliation isn't going to be happening in this generation only. This is going to take generations. He says anti-Indigenous stuff has taken 7 generations to get to this spot. It's going to take 7 more to get back to justice and truth. And reconciliation. And I think the same thing for racial justice, that we're going to have to keep encouraging each other, working at it, reviewing our vision and what we see, what we notice, what our hearts are saying. So I'm going to invite you to pray with me this prayer. Love incarnate, fountain of mercy and justice. In a world of inequity and pain, may our actions be our prayer. We cry out for shalom, fullness of life to all. Let the spirit of truth guide us. Let the spirit of love free us. Give us the compassion, courage, and resolve to become the light we seek, that many may see life and have their dignity restored. Inspire us to embody a world without injustice and prejudice. Form us into channels of your love and peace. Let the river of justice and mercy flood our imperfect world, quenching the thirst of parched souls and lands. Abide in us, O Liberator, that we become the Word, so that the world may have life, life in all its abundance. May the peace of God, which passes all understanding, keep your hearts and minds in the knowledge and love of God and of his Son, Jesus Christ, our Lord. And the blessing of God Almighty, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit rest upon you, remain with you always.
Amen. Amen.
Amen.
Myrna, thank you again for
Thank you. I just want to
us
make
through.
sure everybody's okay.
Oh yeah, it was great.
Okay. We'll use this time. Everyone can pop in and share or talk, and we'll leave the room open for a little bit. And
wonderful session. Thank you.
Thank
you.
you.
Myrna. Thank you so
Everybody's
much.
feeling okay. There's no